It was the kind of fog that swallowed the town whole, rolling in from the sea in thick, ghostly waves. On the eve of Halloween, the coastal town of Kingsport was eerily quiet as a dense mist crept up the streets, engulfing every building, every street lamp, until the world outside looked like a distant memory. Detective Sam Grayson stood at the window of his small, cluttered office, staring out at the thick blanket of fog that covered the town. He was a man of logic, a skeptic by nature, and the stories that had been swirling around Kingsport over the past few days had done nothing but irritate him. Voices in the fog, that's what people were claiming. Faint, distant voices calling out to them, voices of their deceased loved ones. It had started with a few whispered rumors, but had quickly escalated into something that the whole town was talking about. Neighbors, shoekeepers, and even the local mailmen were insisting that they had heard the impossible. Sam wasn't buying it. He turned away from the window, rubbing his temples in frustration. The last thing he needed was more superstitious nonsense. Kingsport was a quiet town, and the most action he usually saw involved petty theft or the occasional bar fight. But this was just ridiculous. His phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, not bothering to hide the irritation in his voice. "Grayson?" "Detective, it's Martha from dispatch," came the voice on the other end. "We've got another report, more voices in the fog. This one's from Mrs. Wilkins on Elm Street. She says she heard her son calling her." Sam sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Mrs. Wilkins' son had died 3 years ago in a car accident. It wasn't the first time someone had reported hearing their dead relatives in the mist, but it was beginning to get out of hand. "I'll check it out," Sam muttered under his breath, before hanging up. He grabbed his coat and his hat, the weight of skepticism heavy on his shoulders. He didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but something strange was happening in Kingsport, and he needed to get to the bottom of it. As he stepped outside, the fog curled around him like icy fingers, wrapping him in its suffocating grip. The streetlights flickered dimly through the haze, and the world beyond seemed distant, distorted. Sam's instincts told him something was off, but his mind refused to entertain the idea of the impossible. He was a man of facts, and facts were what he intended to find. The fog was thicker on Elm Street, so thick that Sam had to walk slowly to avoid stumbling over the uneven cobblestone path. The air felt colder here, damp and heavy, as if the mist itself were alive, breathing around him. As Sam approached Mrs. Wilkins' house, a modest 2-story building with peeling paint and a sagging porch, he paused. The fog clung to the windows like an unwelcome guest, and the whole street was eerily silent, too silent. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing on end, though he quickly brushed the feeling aside. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it cracked open to reveal an elderly woman with tear-streaked eyes and trembling hands. Mrs. Wilkins was usually composed, but tonight, she looked shaken to her core. "Detective," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I heard him. My Bobby. He was calling me from the fog." Sam tried to keep his voice calm, but skepticism laced his words. "Mrs. Wilkins, your son, I know he's gone," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "But I swear, I heard him, clear as day. He was out there, in the mist. He sounded scared, like he needed help." Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. Mrs. Wilkins was a practical woman, not the type to jump to wild conclusions, and yet the sincerity in her voice made him pause. "Did you see anything? Anyone out there?" Sam asked, glancing past her into the fog. Mrs. Wilkins shook her head. "No, just his voice, but I know it was him. A mother knows her child." Sam nodded, though his mind was racing. This wasn't the first report of the voices in the fog, but it was the first time someone had described them with such clarity. He could see the desperation in Mrs. Wilkins' eyes, and for a moment he wondered if grief had finally taken its toll on her. But something deep inside his gut told him that this wasn't just the ramblings of a grieving mother. "I'll look into it," Sam promised, though he wasn't sure what he was even looking for. He left the house and stepped back into the fog, the weight of Mrs. Wilkins' words lingering in his mind. As he walked down the street, he kept his ears open, half expecting to hear the ghostly whispers that had so many in the town spooked. And then, just as he was about to turn the corner, he heard it. A faint, distant voice, soft at first, but growing louder as he strained to hear it. "Sam." He froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was familiar, achingly familiar. His father's voice. The same voice he hadn't heard in nearly 15 years since the day his father had died. "Sam." The voice was clear now, calling to him from somewhere deep within the fog. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. This couldn't be real. His father was dead. He had been dead for years. But the voice, it was unmistakable. Sam's hands clenched into fists, his skepticism wavering for the first time. Something was out there in the fog, something old, something dangerous, and it was calling to him. Sam couldn't shake the feeling of unease as he hurried back to the car, the fog closing in around him like a suffocating shroud. His father's voice still echoed in his mind, taunting him, pulling him toward the mist. But he wasn't about to fall for it. He knew this had to be some kind of trick, a psychological effect of the fog, perhaps something planted deep inside people's minds. But what and why? The next day the reports kept coming in. More townspeople claimed to hear voices in the fog, all of them saying the same thing. Their loved ones were calling out to them. Some were terrified, locking themselves in their homes, while others ventured out, desperate to find the source of the voices. Sam spent the entire morning going from house to house, talking to those who claimed to have heard the voices. The stories were all similar, yet something about them bothered him. The fog wasn't just playing tricks, it was drawing people in, making them vulnerable, and Sam had no idea why. That afternoon he found himself sitting in the town archives, sifting through dusty old records. There had to be something in Kingsport history that explained this strange phenomenon. His mind raced as he flipped through the old newspaper clippings and historical documents, looking for anything that stood out. And then he found it. A faded, crumbling journal entry from 1864. The handwriting was almost illegible, but the words sent a chill down his spine. The fog has returned, just as it did before. The voices are back, calling to us from the sea. We lost half the town last time, and I fear we shall lose even more. The ancient ones stir beneath the waves, waiting for their moment to reclaim what was once theirs. Beware the fog. It is no mere mist. It is a doorway. Sam sat back, his heart racing. The fog wasn't just a natural occurrence. It was something older, something darker, and it had happened before, over a century ago. The fog wasn't just creating illusions. It was opening a door to something ancient and malevolent, something that had been lying in wait for generations. Sam's mind whirled with the implications. If the fog was a doorway, then what was coming through, and why now? He stood abruptly, shoving the journal into his coat pocket. He needed answers and fast. The only person who might know more was Old Tom, the town's unofficial historian and resident conspiracy theorist. If anyone knew the town's darkest secrets, it would be him. As Sam left the archives, the fog began to roll in again, thicker than before. He hurried toward Tom's house, the weight of the ancient journal heavy in his pocket. The fog wasn't just a mystery to be solved, it was a threat. A danger that had returned after more than a century of dormancy. And whatever it was just getting started. Old Tom's house was tucked away at the far edge of town, a decrepit building surrounded by tall, twisted trees. The fog swirled around the house, making it almost impossible to see. Sam knocked at the door, glancing nervously over his shoulder as the mist pressed onto him. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing Tom's gaunt figure. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, as though he hadn't slept in days. "I was wondering when you show up," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "You knew this was going to happen?" Sam replied, stepping inside. "The fog, the voices, you knew." Tom nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I've been waiting for it, detective. I've been waiting for the day the fog would come back." Sam pulled the journal from his coat, slamming it down on the table. "What is this? What's happening to the town?" Tom's eyes flickered toward the journal, but he didn't seem surprised. "The fog. It's not just a natural phenomenon, Sam. It's a doorway to something ancient, something that's been lurking beneath the sea for centuries." Sam's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What's coming through the fog?" Tom sat down heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "A long time ago, before Kingsport was even a town, there were things, creatures. They lived beneath the sea in the dark, waiting. The old stories say they were banished long ago, sealed away by something, some kind of magic or force. But every so often, the fog rolls in, and they try to come back." Sam listened in stunned silence as Tom continued. "The voices, they're not your loved ones, they're bait. They're luring people into the fog, making them think they can find their dead relatives. But once you go into the fog, you're lost. The ancient ones take you." Sam felt a surge of anger and fear. "Why didn't you warn anyone? You knew this was going to happen, and you didn't say anything." Tom looked up, his eyes haunted. "Would you have believed me, detective?" "You wouldn't have. No one would have. But it's happening now. The fog is back, and this time, it's stronger." Sam's mind raced. The fog wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a deadly force, and it was growing in power. People were disappearing into it, lured by the voices of their dead, and soon, more would follow. "How do we stop it?" Sam asked, his voice urgent. Tom shook his head slowly. "I don't know if we can. The ancient ones, they've been waiting for this for a long time, and once they break through completely, there's no stopping them." The weight of Tom's words hung heavy in the air. The fog was more than just a supernatural occurrence. It was the beginning of something far worse and time was running out. Following night descended upon Kingsport, and the fog was thicker than ever. It blanketed the town in an oppressive, unnatural silence, and the people who had been lured by the voices had vanished without a trace. Sam stood at the edge of town, his breath visible in the cold air as he stared into the endless fog. He knew what was out there now, something ancient, something hungry, and he was waiting for the right moment to strike. He had tried to warn the townspeople, but most had dismissed him as paranoid. Some had even gone searching for their loved ones in the mist, convinced they would bring them back. Sam had watched in helpless frustration as more and more people disappeared. Now it was just him and the fog. Tom's warning echoed in his mind. Once they break through completely, there's no stopping them. Sam clenched his jaw, gripping the revolver in his hand. He knew bullets wouldn't stop whatever was out there, but it was all he had. He wasn't going to let this thing take his town without a fight. The fog swirled around him, thick and suffocating, and then he heard it. Sam. His father's voice again. Clearer this time, closer. It was coming from deep within the mist, calling to him, drawing him in. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step forward, then another. His father was gone, he knew that, but the voice, it sounded so real. He stopped, shaking his head. It's a trick. It's not real. But the voice continued, pleading, begging him to come closer, and for a moment, Sam felt the urge to walk into the fog, to find the source of the voice, to see his father again, even just for a moment. He took another step, and then out of the mist a figure emerged. It was tall, humanoid, but wrong, its skin gray and molted, its eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. It wasn't his father. It wasn't even human. Sam stumbled back, his heart racing as the creature reached out toward him with long, twisted fingers. The fog around it pulsed, as though alive, feeding off the presence of the creature. He fired his revolver, but the bullets passed through the thing like it was made of smoke. It didn't even flinch. The fog thickened and more figures appeared, their glowing eyes piercing through the mist. Sam's stomach turned as he realized the truth. These were the people who had disappeared into the fog. They had been taken, transformed into something monstrous, and now they were part of an ancient force that was trying to break through. The fog wasn't just a doorway, it was a trap, and Sam had walked right into it. Sam backed away, his mind racing as the creatures closed in. He could feel the weight of the ancient forest pressing down on him, suffocating him, pulling him towards the darkness that lurked within the fog. But then, through the haze of fear and panic, a thought struck him. The fog is a doorway. Tom had said it himself. The fog wasn't just a supernatural phenomenon. It was a rift, a connection to something beyond this world, and if it was a doorway, there had to be a way to close it. But how? Sam's eyes darted around the fog, searching for something, anything that could help him. And then he remembered the journal. The old journal he had found in the archives had mentioned a ritual, something about sealing the ancient ones away, but he hadn't had time to read it all, and now it was out of reach. The creatures were getting closer, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their twisted forms moving through the fog with eerie grace. Sam's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized he was running out of time, and then, through the fog, he saw it. A shape, a figure, standing at the edge of the mist. Tom. The old man stepped forward, his face pale but determined. He held something in his hands, an old, weathered book. The journal. "Tom!" Sam shouted, his voice hoarse. Tom didn't answer, he just opened the book, his eyes scanning the pages with desperate speed. "The ritual," Tom muttered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "There's a way to close the rift, but..." Sam's heart raced. "But what?" Tom looked up, his eyes filled with sorrow. "It requires a sacrifice." The words hit Sam like a punch to the gut. A sacrifice? Of course, there's always a price for these things. But who and how? Before Sam could ask, Tom stepped forward, placing the book on the ground between them. "The ritual must be completed by someone who has crossed the threshold of the fog," he said quietly. "Someone who has been touched by it." Sam's blood ran cold. "That's me." Tom nodded, as if reading his thoughts. "You've heard the voices. You've seen the creatures. You're connected to the fog now. You're the only one who can close the rift." Sam's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what Tom was saying. He was the only one who could stop this, the only one who could save the town. But the price, there had to be another way. Tom shook his head slowly. "There isn't. I've read the journal. This is the only way." The fog swirled around them, thick and oppressive, and Sam could feel the ancient force pressing in on him, pulling at him, trying to drag him into the void. He looked at Tom, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he knew he had to make. And then, with a deep breath, Sam stepped forward, toward the fog. "I'll do it," he said quietly. Tom's eyes filled with sorrow, but he nodded. "You'll save us, Sam. You'll save us all." And with that, Sam reached out, his hand plunging into the fog, the of ancient force pulling him as a creature closed in around him. The fog swallowed him whole, and then there was silence. The town of Kingsport was saved, but no one would ever know the price Sam had to pay to close the doorway to the Ancient Ones. No one except Tom.